Hello, my name is Nolan Rhodes, and this PowerPoint serves as the presentation portion for the research assignment for CJ497, Comparative Criminal Justice. The topic of this presentation will be an analysis of the justice systems of each of our model nations. I will do this by showing historical events that helped shape each system. I will also show current policy details of each criminal justice system and how they interact with the people which live in these nations. I will also compare and contrast these model nations and their justice systems to the other 5 model nations on our list. And finally, I will compare each model nation and their justice systems to ours here in the United States. The 6 model nations in which I will analyze, compare, and contrast each justice system with one another is England, France, Germany, China, Japan, and finally Saudi Arabia. The first of these model nations to be examined is that of England. England is under a common law system, which means judges and legal professionals base their decisions and rulings off prior decisions and rulings by other judges and what was known as legal tradition. The system can be traced back to the Norman Conquest days, which occurred in 1066. William the Conqueror figured out that it was much easier to militarily take over the English than it actually was to legally rule over them. So another feature of the common law system is that they have an independent judicial system, which means the judges in the criminal justice system operates independently from the actual, I guess would be the executive and the parliamentary branches of the government over there. Another feature they have is what's known as stare decisis, which means let it stand, which can be broken down to, like I said earlier, with the common law. The feature of common law is that all the decisions are not necessarily based off of a codified law book. It's based off of prior judge rulings. Up until recently, actually, they just came out with the Constitutional Reform Act in 2005, which gave or established the English Supreme Court, who acts in a way where they're the say-all, end-all in any kind of legal matters or any legal matters or any decision the government makes or anything. It's in a way a good way to picture it would be like our Supreme Court here in the United States. Since there's no real written penal code in England, they do have statutes, however, which do express some, felonies, which would be, in this case, arrestable offenses, and any other offenses would be unarrestable. A comparison to this is the United States. We're basically under a common law system, even though we do have more substantial penal code than England does. Something to point out would be like what I learned along the way here doing this research paper was, an unarrestable offense in England was impersonating a police officer, which if someone did that in England, they get cited and they possibly, get ticketed and that kind of thing. They might get summoned to court later, but they wouldn't be necessarily arrested that day, or they wouldn't be arrested that day because it's an unarrestable offense. But in the United States, that's a serious crime, and you will be arrested for doing that same act here, and we wouldn't over there in England. The second of the countries to be examined is France. France is currently under a civil law system. The modern system and the civil law system in France can be dated back to the French Revolution time of 1789, where France passed their Declaration of Rights of Man and the Citizen, which could be similarly based off, or not based off of, but similarly compared to our Bill of Rights, which we have. For a short period of time, Napoleon Bonaparte was actually in charge of France, and he was an emperor, so dictator basically. So he was not very. The system he made, legal system, was very strict and was not lenient towards criminal matters or crimes in general. Today, France is highly bureaucratic, codified, and their legal system is very centralized, meaning that any kind of law if someone breaks in France is a federal law. and everything is universal throughout the whole nation. Because of this, police are actually divided only into two separate groups, which are both federal. The first is the Police Nationale, which work under like the federal government, and the second one, which I'm probably going to get the pronunciation wrong, is Gendarmerie, which they operate under the military wing of France. It's the armed forces basically. Another similarity France would share with the United States regarding their legal systems would be they both were birthed from a revolution, and because of that, they basically want to create a system where everybody's equal and everybody's free from their government to a certain extent. And we'll see next the next couple of countries that which are both civil law, they actually share quite a bit of few things together. The third justice system on our list to be analyzed here is that of Germany. Germany, like France, is under a civil law system, where but their major historic event wasn't a revolution, but was actually because they were on the losing side of a war, World War II, after the Nazi regime fell, when the country was divided into two basic sections, one being controlled by the Soviets and the second controlled by England and the United States, the Western power. So, as we'll get to later when we study about China, is that they're under a socialist law system, and the same was Eastern Germany was under a socialist law system, which is a civil law system, and while the western half of the country was under a basic law system, which though it was civil law, it was based off of, or not based off of, but it was influenced by Western powers such as the United States and England. However, in 1990, the Berlin Wall fell, the Soviets lost the Cold War, and the country was reunified. France operates under the concept of federalism, and they're classified as a federalist republic, meaning, well, they do have a central government, federal government. They also have state governments, kind of like the United States does, but to a lesser extent, meaning that if they break a law, or all the statutes and law in France, or which are highly codified, by the way, because it is a civil law system, if these laws are broken, and they're all federal laws, kind of like France is. However, each state does have their own police and own courthouses and stuff like that. They just don't have a separate state penal code as we do in the United States. The next justice system of our model nations brings us out of Europe and into the East Asia. The next country is China. China right now is currently under a socialist law system, which is a form of civil law system. The major historic event, which could be attributed to putting them in the current situation they're in now, is the 1949 Communist Revolution, where the Communist Party, led by Mao Zedong, took over the nation from the nationalists that were in control before them. And during this time, they adopted many ideas from Soviet Union, which adopted their ideas from Karl Marx, and they had the Lenin and Stalin, all that stuff, the concept of really strict, straightforward, classical communism. During this communist rule between 1949 and until the death of Mao Zedong in 1976, they adopted this really strict communism, meaning that they looked at penal codes, especially when it came to criminal law, as a way to kind of like bringing people down in a way where it made people unequal. And supposedly, in a communist system, everybody needs to be clear-cut, equal, 100%. So they, rather than having a really strict penal code and really lengthy penal code, like in most civil law, they really just had, unofficial customs and traditions where, you just did what you were told basically by the Communist Party, and there was no other ways around it. Because of this, which is communism very known for, is having an extremely centralized justice system and government in general. However, in China today, which leaded up to or beforehand, from 1976 to today, the leaders of China have been slowly bringing them out of this ultra-communist section where they still remain communist, but they adapt in some ways and another, where now they do have a certain penal code of some crimes, and they and a lot of other statutes and things of that matter. However, they're supposedly divided into several levels of different oversights: the prosecution, the judicial, the police, and corrections, all supposed to be different, total different levels of the government to kind of like weed out any conflicts of interests, so to speak. However, when it comes to real life, that they all answer to the Communist Party, and the Communist Party does get its wish when it concerns any kind of federal or not federal, any kind of criminal acts or anything. They'll punish the person however they deem fit. In China being so different from in many ways from the rest of the nations that I've examined so far, it doesn't really share too many similarities with any of the nations. However, it is a civil law of France and Germany, but it doesn't really much go further than that. France and Germany and China, as far as legal systems, don't really share too much in common besides that they are civil law. As we move even further east in Asia, the next one on our list of model nations is that of Japan. Japan's a little different, though, however, quite different from China, because like Germany, they ended up on the losing side of World War II. So again, they were occupied to an extent, and to a higher extent, influenced by the United States, because the United States were the major role in fighting Japan and during the World War II. So 1945, Imperial Japan fell. However, their system is highly centralized, as in everything's federal. They're not necessarily a civil law structure or civil law structure like France and Germany would be, but they're not completely common law like the United States, and even more common law would be England. They're right in the middle somewhere, where they have they have a legal codes and penal codes, sentencing codes, all that stuff, even criminal procedure codes on how to prosecute somebody, where judges go by a certain set of codes, but they also use the concept of like stare decisis, where judges do base a lot of their rulings and decisions in the courtroom on prior decisions that were made in the courts of Japan. So if there's a big similarity or major similarities that Japan shares with any of the other countries, which would be the United States by far, because we helped them build it over there, build their justice system, their constitution, all that stuff, the reunification of Okinawa, all that stuff was all contributed to us and urged, or at least influenced by us to a certain extent. The final justice system on our list to be analyzed is that of Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia is a definite outlier compared to the other nations on our list here, meaning that they don't really share too much in common with any of the other nations. Saudi Arabia bases their law not on socialist law, not on civil law, not on common law. However, they base it on Islamic law, which is known as Sharia. Even to this day, they're a theocratic monarchy, which means they're controlled by, their religion is 100% above everything else. And they have a king who's, just like an old king of the olden times, is the head of the state, the head of everything. The legal sources actually is not, they don't use prior judges' decisions. They don't use a extensive penal code or written laws. They use, or modern written laws. Their legal sources are the Quran and the Sunnah. As far as governmental responsibilities, would be just the king and his ministers are in charge of all government functions from top down of all the branches, which would be the equivalent of executive, judicial, and legislative. All decisions, everything could be made at all levels, all by the king. This judicial system is based on all Islamic tradition and based on the holy books. However, in 1993, Saudi Arabia passed they ratified the Basic Law of Government, which is kind of an unofficial constitution, which I'll get to in a minute. Um, and all that did was outline the basic functions of the government more on just how they should operate. I guess I wouldn't say a secular level because everything there is controlled by religion, but not so much from like a standpoint of application of the Islamic law, but just how they should function. So it's not really a constitution. While many of the people who live in Saudi Arabia consider the Quran the constitution of the country, but Saudi Arabia to this day does not have an official constitution, and that's probably the only similarity it shares with another country on our list, which is that of England, who to this day doesn't have a constitution. So to wrap up some similarities and differences here of our model nations and to the United States, said the civil law, group is the largest group here. We got France, Germany, and they're really into the civil law. And then to some extent we have Japan and then China, which is civil law, is classified as civil law, but they're still under socialist law, which is it technically is civil law, but it's also kind of its own thing too. Common law, England's by far their far common law system. That's what they do over there. They don't really have too many written statutes and definitely don't have an extensive penal code, which the United States, we are a system of common law, but we did adopt, aspects of civil laws. We do have a central federal government. We do have federal statutes and federal laws, federal police, federal courts, all that stuff. But for the most part, the criminal justice is carried out by the states, and each state in the United States, meaning us, like Germany, have the concept of federalism, where you have a central government, but you also have, states, and the states with their own proceedings and courthouses and that kind of thing. But the United States definitely takes that federalism to the next step over Germany, in which most penal codes and all the not all, but most of the trials and criminal justice is carried out by the particular state, which creates some of a discrepancy that some people might not agree too much with, because one thing could be illegal in one state and be completely illegal in another. So it definitely gives us a different outlook on criminal justice than most other nations. Islamic law, we only had one. Just briefly talked about Saudi Arabia. Another big important thing here, which is a feature of common law that I touched on earlier, is judicial independence, meaning that the judges and the judicial system operates independently from, I guess, like the centralized federal government. I mean, it is part of the federal government, but it's not. They don't have any legislative powers and that sort of thing. They just make their rulings based on what they believe to be correct and past rulings that were already made on that same side of matter, which a lot of people would take take for granted, I believe. But for us, it'd be the judicial review of our nation was passed back in the 1700s or 1789. Gave the Supreme Court the ability to make a ruling on what they believed was constitutional and what wasn't constitutional, which England did that eventually in 2005. But I believe that's a very important aspect of a free nation to have. It's just my little 2 cents on it. So wrapping things up here, before I took this course, I would have believed that most of these nations did not share, much of, not all in common. I knew France and Germany were pretty much similar, but other than that, I thought these nations were very different. And though they are different, they have a different justice systems than each other, they do share more in common than I would have believed. And this is probably just because when a new nation is built, they want the people who are in charge want their nation to succeed and do good, so they'll adapt from other countries which had great success in a certain system, which some systems were legal systems and they worked, like the United States. When they won the independence over England, they adopted many ideas of the common law system. they added their own and took away some and adapted it for themselves. So that's another reason why I think a lot of them are different, because there's no cookie cutter what's the best justice system to have. However, there's elements of others that are definitely better than some elements of another. So when a country does take from ideas from another country regarding the justice system or anything, they're gonna modify it, partly just because they want their own national identity and they want to do stuff what fits their people the best. So that concludes my presentation. Thank you.